A young director, barely 30 years old, stands on a muddy field outside Munich, surrounded by 600 German police officers dressed as French soldiers. He has just ordered his cameraman to sprint directly into a live pyrotechnics barrage, real explosions detonating 15 feet from the lens, because the shot wasn't visceral enough the first time. The cameraman refuses. The director fires him on the spot, picks up the camera himself, and runs into the smoke. His name is Stanley Kubrick, and he is making a film that will be banned in France for 18 years, censored by the United States military, and nearly destroyed by the very studio that financed it. Paths of Glory was supposed to be a modest anti-war picture. Instead, it became a production soaked in political fury, personal vendettas, and genuine physical danger. The finished film runs a lean 88 minutes. But behind those 88 minutes lies a war story almost as savage as the one on screen. Let's pull back the curtain and uncover 15 dark secrets about Paths of Glory they never wanted you to know. Number 15. The script that Hollywood refused to touch for 20 years. Humphrey Cobb's novel, Paths of Glory, was published in 1935, a raw, unsparing account of a real incident during the First World War in which French soldiers were executed by their own army to set an example. It was praised by critics. It won literary awards. And then it sat on shelves in Hollywood for 2 decades because no studio would go near it. The reason was simple. The story had no hero who triumphed, no romance that redeemed the tragedy, and no ending that let the audience feel good about the sacrifices of war. Every producer who picked up the manuscript put it back down with the same note. Too depressing, no commercial angle. In the 1940s, a stage adaptation briefly ran on Broadway, but it was poorly attended and quickly forgotten. The material seemed destined to remain a literary footnote, admired but untouchable. Then, in 1955, a struggling screenwriter named Jim Thompson, the same Jim Thompson who wrote pulp noir masterpieces like The Killer Inside Me, partnered with a young novelist named Calder Willingham to take another crack at a screenplay. Thompson had a reputation for unflinching darkness. Willingham had a gift for razor-sharp dialogue. Together, they produced a draft that was leaner and more furious than any previous attempt. But even with a strong script, no studio would finance it. The project circled through rejection after rejection until it landed on the desk of a 27-year-old director who had just made a heist picture called The Killing for very little money and even less studio support. Kubrick read the script in a single sitting and reportedly said, "This is the best thing I've ever read." He didn't care that it was uncommercial. He didn't care that it ended in despair. That stubbornness would define the entire production, and nearly end his career before it truly began. The film existed only because one young man was too obsessed to listen to reason. Number 14. Kirk Douglas strong-armed the studio into making it. Even Stanley Kubrick had passion. What he did not have was power. In 1956, Kubrick was a former Look magazine photographer with 2 low-budget features to his name and no leverage whatsoever in the studio system. He could not get Paths of Glory made on his own. The man who could was Kirk Douglas, and Douglas did not come cheap, not in dollars and not in control. Douglas had just come off the massive success of Lust for Life, in which he played Vincent van Gogh, and he was looking for material that would cement his reputation as a serious dramatic actor, not just a square-jawed action star. When Kubrick brought him the Paths of Glory script, Douglas read it and immediately saw the role of Colonel Dax as the kind of righteous, morally tortured protagonist that won Academy Awards. He committed on the spot. But his commitment came with conditions. Douglas used his production company, Briner Productions, to package the deal. He negotiated himself a salary that consumed a massive portion of the film's already thin budget. And he insisted on final say over key creative decisions, a demand that would put him on a collision course with Kubrick almost immediately. The power dynamic was brutal. Kubrick was the visionary, but Douglas was the engine. Without Douglas's name, United Artists would not have written a check. Without Douglas's production company, there would be no infrastructure to get the film made in Europe. Kubrick understood this, and he resented it deeply. According to multiple accounts from crew members, the two men respected each other's talent, but clashed almost daily over tone, pacing, and the emotional temperature of the film. Douglas wanted Colonel Dax to be more heroic, more outwardly passionate. Kubrick wanted him colder, more restrained, more trapped by a system he could not defeat. It was the fundamental tension of the entire production. The star wanted an audience to love him, and the director wanted the audience to feel sick. Neither man would fully get his way, and the friction between them crackled through every single day of shooting. Number 13. The ending Kubrick wanted, and the one he was forced to film. Stanley Kubrick's original vision for the final scene of Paths of Glory was simple and devastating. After the three soldiers are executed, innocent men killed to protect the egos of incompetent generals, the film would simply end. No redemption, no softening, no glimmer of hope, just death, and then silence, and then a black screen. Kubrick believed that any attempt to comfort the audience after such an atrocity would be a betrayal of the film's entire purpose. Kirk Douglas disagreed violently. Douglas argued that audiences needed something, not a happy ending, but a moment of human grace that would keep them from walking out of the theater feeling only numbness. He pushed hard for a final scene that would give Colonel Dax a moment of quiet emotional power, something to remind the audience that decency still existed even in the middle of institutional murder. The argument between the two men reportedly lasted for days and became genuinely heated, with Kubrick at one point telling Douglas that sentimentality was the enemy of truth. The compromise that emerged became one of the most famous endings in cinema history, but almost by accident. Kubrick's wife at the time, the German actress Christiane Harlan, was cast in the tiny role of the German girl who sings to the French soldiers in a tavern. The scene was not in the original script. It was conceived during production as a way to bridge the gap between Kubrick's nihilism and Douglas's desire for emotional catharsis. In the finished film, the captured German woman sings a folk song to a room full of rowdy, exhausted soldiers, and slowly, one by one, the men stop jeering and begin to weep. It is heartbreaking precisely because it is so fragile, a moment of shared humanity in a world that has systematically destroyed it. Kubrick later admitted the scene worked beautifully, but he never forgot that it was forced on him. For the rest of his life, he bristled at the suggestion that the film's emotional power came from that ending, because he knew the real power was supposed to come from its absence. The scene that audiences remember most tenderly was born from a fight neither man truly won. Number 12. The French government treated the film like an act of war. Before a single frame of Paths of Glory was projected in a French theater, the French government had already decided the film was an enemy. The story it told, of French generals ordering the execution of their own soldiers to cover up a catastrophic military blunder, was not ancient history to France. It was a national wound that had never properly healed. The real incidents that inspired Humphrey Cobb's novel had occurred during the First World War, and the families of the executed soldiers had spent decades fighting for official acknowledgement that their loved ones had been murdered by their own command structure. The French military establishment had no interest in a Hollywood film ripping that wound back open. When United Artists attempted to distribute the film in France in 1957, the response was immediate and ferocious. French veterans organizations publicly condemned the picture as anti-French propaganda. The French Ministry of Defense pressured distributors to refuse it. French military officials lobbied behind the scenes, arguing that the film would damage Franco-American relations and insult the memory of French soldiers who had served honorably. The film was not technically banned by law in France. Rather, it was subjected to such enormous institutional pressure that no French distributor dared release it. The result was the same. The film vanished from French screens entirely. It would not be shown publicly in France until 1975, 18 years after its release. Even then, its screening provoked controversy. In Switzerland, the film was banned outright from military bases, with Swiss officials concerned it would damage morale. In parts of Belgium, screenings were canceled under political pressure. The film that Kubrick made as a universal statement against the machinery of war was treated by multiple European governments as a live grenade. The censorship was not about obscenity or violence. It was about shame, the kind of shame that governments will spend decades trying to bury. The studio shrugged and moved on, but the silence spoke louder than any review. Number 11. The chateau was a real aristocratic estate, and its owners were furious. One of the most striking visual contrasts in Paths of Glory is the difference between the filthy, corpse-strewn trenches where the soldiers suffer and the opulent, immaculate chateau where the generals sip cognac and plot their careers. Kubrick was obsessed with this contrast. He wanted the generals' headquarters to feel obscenely beautiful, so that every gilded mirror and polished marble floor would function as an indictment. To achieve this, he needed a real chateau, not a studio set. The production secured permission to film at Schleißheim Palace, a Baroque palace complex near Munich, Germany. Schleißheim was an architectural treasure, sprawling, ornate, dripping with the kind of aristocratic excess that Kubrick wanted to weaponize on screen. The production team moved in with lights, cameras, cables, and hundreds of crew members. What followed was a slow-motion disaster of diplomacy. The palace administrators had agreed to the filming under the assumption that a Hollywood production would be careful, professional, and brief. Kubrick's crew was none of these things. The director demanded take after take of the long, elaborate tracking shots that would become the film's visual signature. Furniture was moved, floors were scuffed, lighting rigs were bolted to walls that had survived centuries of European history. According to production accounts, relations between the film crew and the palace administration deteriorated rapidly. There were complaints about damage to the floors from dolly tracks. There were disputes about which rooms could be used and for how long. Kubrick characteristically ignored most of these complaints, viewing them as obstacles to his vision rather than legitimate concerns. The tension reached a point where the production was reportedly asked to accelerate its schedule and vacate the premises earlier than planned. Kubrick got his shots, those magnificent gliding corridors that make the general's world feel like a gilded prison. But he burned bridges in the process. The beauty on screen was purchased with very real friction behind the camera. The palace looked timeless. The relationships did not survive the week. Number 10. 600. German policemen became the French army. Kubrick needed an army. The budget did not include one. Paths of Glory was being produced in Germany on a shoestring. The total budget was approximately $935,000, a figure that was modest even by 1957 standards. There was no money for hundreds of professional extras to fill the trenches and charge across no man's land. Kubrick needed bodies, and he needed them cheap. The solution came from an unlikely source, the German police force. Through arrangements with local Munich authorities, the production secured approximately 600 off-duty German police officers to serve as extras playing French soldiers. The irony was not lost on anyone. Barely 12 years after the end of the Second World War, German men were being dressed in French military uniforms and ordered to charge across a muddy field while explosions detonated around them. The historical layers were disorienting, and the atmosphere on set was reportedly thick with unspoken tension. The police extras were not actors. They had no training in hitting marks, following choreography, or responding to a director's increasingly specific demands. Kubrick, who was already developing the obsessive perfectionism that would define his later career, pushed them relentlessly. The battle sequences required the extras to run through smoke, mud, and controlled explosions, repeatedly for hours, in takes that were often scrapped and restarted because the movement didn't look chaotic enough, or the smoke drifted the wrong way, or the camera operator couldn't keep pace. Several extras reportedly suffered minor injuries from falls, debris, and proximity to pyrotechnic charges. There were complaints. There were refusals. Kubrick, according to crew members, responded to resistance with cold indifference. The shot mattered more than the complaint. The result on screen is extraordinary. The battle sequences in Paths of Glory remain among the most visceral and convincing combat scenes ever filmed, precisely because the men on screen are not acting confused and terrified. They are confused and terrified. They are real men being asked to run toward real explosions, directed by a man who would not stop until the image in his viewfinder matched the image in his head. The soldiers looked real because the suffering was real. The army was made of cops, and Kubrick treated them like infantry. Number 9. Kubrick's tracking shots nearly broke the crew. The most technically audacious element of Paths of Glory is its trench tracking shots. Long, unbroken takes in which the camera moves ahead of Colonel Dax as he walks through the narrow, winding trenches before the doomed attack. These shots are now studied in film schools as masterpieces of camera movement. At the time, they were a logistical nightmare that pushed the crew to the edge of mutiny. The trenches were constructed on a large open field near Munich. They were built to historically accurate dimensions, which meant they were narrow, uneven, and difficult to navigate even on foot, let alone with a heavy camera rig mounted on dolly tracks. Kubrick insisted that the tracks be laid inside the trenches themselves, creating a smooth path for the camera to glide along while Kirk Douglas walked behind it. The problem was that the trenches were designed to look realistic, with irregular walls, muddy floors, and sharp corners. Every time the dolly needed to navigate a turn, the crew had to engineer a solution on the fly. Curved track sections, manual adjustments, timing the camera operator's movements with Douglas's pace down to the second. Kubrick demanded take after take. If the camera wobbled, they started over. If Douglas's pace was a fraction too fast or slow, they started over. If an extra in the background looked at the camera, they started over. The camera operator, working in cramped conditions with heavy equipment, was physically exhausted after multiple consecutive takes. The grips laying and adjusting track were working in mud and cold for hours at a stretch. According to crew accounts, the atmosphere during these shooting days was grim and tense, with Kubrick offering almost no verbal encouragement and simply calling for another take with a flat, emotionless "again." The finished shots run for mere minutes on screen, but they consumed days of production time. They are seamless, hypnotic, almost unbearably tense, the camera pulling the viewer forward into the horror that awaits. Every second of that fluidity was purchased with exhaustion and frustration. The audience feels dread. The crew felt something very similar, but for entirely different reasons. Number 8. The execution scene demanded real emotional collapse. The climax of Paths of Glory is the execution of 3 innocent soldiers, Private Farrell, Private Arnault, and Corporal Paris, selected essentially at random to die for the failure of an attack that was doomed from the start. The scene is devastating on screen, and the reason it works so powerfully is that Kubrick refused to let his actors fake it. The 3 actors playing the condemned men, Timothy Carey, Ralph Meeker, and Joe Turkel, were each handled differently by Kubrick in the lead-up to filming the execution sequence. Kubrick understood that each actor had a different emotional instrument, and he manipulated those instruments with surgical precision. Timothy Carey, who played Private Farrell, was a method actor known for volatile, unpredictable behavior. Kubrick gave Cary enormous freedom to improvise his emotional reactions, knowing that Cary's instability would translate into the kind of raw, uncontrolled desperation that no amount of traditional directing could manufacture. Meeker, who played Corporal Paris, was kept more tightly controlled, his performance guided toward a quieter, more dignified resignation. The filming itself was grueling. Kubrick shot the execution sequence over multiple days, returning to it again and again, adjusting angles, demanding more intensity, more terror, more physical specificity from the actors. The men playing the condemned soldiers were required to be bound to the execution posts for extended periods between takes, standing in the cold, maintaining their emotional readiness, while Kubrick repositioned cameras and adjusted lighting. The physical discomfort was not accidental. Kubrick understood that genuine discomfort eroded the barrier between performance and reality. The on-screen result is one of the most harrowing execution scenes ever committed to film. The terror is palpable. The injustice is suffocating. When Corporal Paris struggles to maintain his composure and Private Ferrall collapses in hysterical weeping, the audience is not watching acting in the conventional sense. They are watching human beings subjected to conditions designed to produce real emotional distress, captured by a director who believed that the only honest image was one that cost something to create. It was cinema at its most effective and its most ruthless. Number 7. Timothy Cary was fired. And the story changes depending on who tells it. Timothy Cary was a problem. Everyone on the set of Paths of Glory agreed on that much. What they could not agree on, and what remains disputed to this day, is exactly what happened and why he was removed from the production before filming was complete. Cary was a character actor with a reputation for being brilliantly talented and absolutely impossible to work with. He had a history of improvising wildly, ignoring directors' instructions, showing up late, and creating chaos on set. Kubrick cast him as Private Ferrall specifically because of that volatility. He wanted Cary's unhinged energy for the role of a terrified, doomed soldier. But the gamble came with a price. Accounts of what went wrong vary dramatically. One version, repeated by several crew members over the years, is that Cary staged his own kidnapping during production, disappearing from the set and causing a full-day shutdown while the production scrambled to find him. According to this account, Cary eventually turned up unharmed, claiming he had been abducted, a story no one believed. Another version suggests that Cary's behavior on set, refusing to follow directions, arguing with Kubrick, disrupting other actors' performances, simply became intolerable, and Kubrick dismissed him once his essential scenes were in the can. Cary himself, in later interviews, told yet another version, insisting that he was let go because of a contractual dispute, and that the stories about his behavior were exaggerated by people who resented his talent. What is clear is that Cary was removed from the production before the final days of shooting, and that certain planned scenes involving Private Ferrall were either rewritten or eliminated as a result. Kubrick never publicly discussed the details. Douglas, in his autobiography, mentioned Cary's difficult behavior but was vague about the specifics. The truth is buried under layers of Hollywood mythology, ego, and selective memory. What survives is Cary's performance, feral, terrifying, heartbreaking, one of the best things in the film, delivered by a man who may or may not have faked his own kidnapping to get attention. The chaos behind the camera somehow became art in front of it. Number 6. The film nearly destroyed Kubrick's relationship with Kirk Douglas. The professional partnership between Stanley Kubrick and Kirk Douglas on Paths of Glory is often described as a collaboration between two strong-willed artists. The reality was closer to a controlled demolition. The two men fought about virtually everything: the script, the tone, the ending, the shooting schedule, the treatment of extras, and most importantly, the emotional temperature of Kirk Douglas's performance. Douglas wanted to play Colonel Dax as a passionate crusader, a man visibly burning with righteous anger at the injustice of the military tribunal. He wanted the audience to see a hero. Kubrick wanted something far more unsettling, a man who understands the system, who fights within it, and who ultimately fails because the system is designed to crush exactly this kind of decency. Kubrick's Dax was supposed to be restrained, almost clinical, his fury expressed through stillness rather than speeches. Douglas found this approach insufferable. He was a movie star, and movie stars did not stand still while the world burned around them. The daily battles over these two competing visions made the set tense and uncomfortable for everyone. Crew members later recalled that the two men would argue before takes, sometimes loudly, and then Douglas would deliver a performance that fell somewhere between his instinct and Kubrick's instruction, and Kubrick would quietly call for another take, adjusting Douglas incrementally toward his own vision without ever saying so directly. It was manipulation disguised as collaboration, and Douglas was experienced enough to recognize it, which only made him angrier. Despite the friction, or perhaps because of it, the two men would go on to work together again on Spartacus in 1960. But that collaboration ended even more explosively, with Kubrick essentially disowning the film and Douglas never forgiving him for it. The seeds of that later rupture were planted in the trenches of Paths of Glory, where two enormous egos discovered they could produce something extraordinary together, but could not stand the process of doing so. The masterpiece was forged in hostility, and the alliance never recovered. Number 5. The real French mutinies were far more horrifying than the film showed. Kubrick's film is devastating, but it is, by any historical measure, a softened version of what actually happened. The real events that inspired Humphrey Cobb's novel, and by extension the film, involved atrocities so systematic and so cold-blooded that even Kubrick could not depict them fully without losing his audience entirely. During the spring of 1917, following the catastrophic failure of the Nivelle offensive, the French army experienced widespread mutinies. Tens of thousands of soldiers refused to continue participating in suicidal frontal assaults against entrenched German positions. The mutinies were not acts of cowardice. They were acts of rational self-preservation by men who had watched their comrades slaughtered in attacks that their own commanders knew were futile. The French High Command's response was savage. Approximately 3,500 soldiers were court-martialed. Over 500 were sentenced to death. At least 49 were actually executed by firing squad, though historians suspect the real number was higher as records were deliberately destroyed or sealed. The specific incident that most closely mirrors the plot of Paths of Glory occurred at the village of Soin in 1915, where 4 corporals from the 336th Infantry Regiment were selected for execution after their unit failed to advance during an attack. The selection was essentially arbitrary. These men were chosen not because they had done anything wrong, but because their generals needed scapegoats. They were shot at dawn. Their families were not informed of the true circumstances for years. Kubrick knew all of this. He researched the real incidents extensively. But he also knew that depicting the full scale of the French military's internal repression, the hundreds of courts-martial, the secret executions, the systematic cover-ups, would overwhelm the narrative focus of his film. So he distilled the horror down to 3 men, 1 trial, and 1 execution. The compression made the story more powerful as cinema, but it also inadvertently softened the truth. The real darkness was so vast that even a film about darkness could only capture a fraction of it. Number 4. Adolphe Menjou's performance was fueled by a disturbing, real-world parallel. Adolphe Menjou, who delivered one of the film's most chilling performances as the calculating, amoral General Brulard, brought something deeply uncomfortable to the role. A personal history that mirrored the very institutional cruelty the film condemned. Menjou was, in real life, one of Hollywood's most notorious anti-communist crusaders, a man who had enthusiastically cooperated with the House Un-American Activities Committee and publicly supported the blacklisting of writers, directors, and actors accused of leftist sympathies. The irony was staggering. In Paths of Glory, Monjou played a general who sacrifices innocent men to preserve the power structure. In real life, Monjou had participated in a system that destroyed innocent careers to preserve political orthodoxy. Kubrick was acutely aware of this parallel, and several people close to the production have suggested that the casting was not accidental, that Kubrick wanted Monjou precisely because the actor's real-life willingness to serve power would inform the performance in ways that went beyond technique. On set, Monjou was the consummate professional, polished, prepared, and icily charming, exactly like General Brulard. But the tension between Monjou and other members of the cast and crew who held different political views was palpable. This was 1957. The blacklist era was not ancient history, it was a fresh wound. Writers and directors in Hollywood were still being denied work because of accusations that men like Monjou had helped legitimize. To watch him portray a man who destroys the powerless with a smile and a handshake was, for some people on that set, not a performance at all. Kubrick never publicly discussed whether he cast Monjou for these reasons. He rarely discussed his casting decisions in ideological terms, but the result speaks for itself. Monjou's Brulard is one of the great screen villains precisely because he does not feel like a villain. He feels like a system, calm and smiling, and absolutely indifferent to the human cost of his decisions. Whether that ease came from craft or from character is a question the film leaves provocatively unanswered. The most terrifying performance in the film may not have been entirely a performance. Number 3. United Artists tried to force a happy ending. The studio wanted the soldiers to live. This is not speculation or rumor. It is documented fact. United Artists, which financed and distributed Paths of Glory, was deeply uncomfortable with the film's uncompromising ending and actively pressured Kubrick and Douglas to change it. The studio's preferred alternative was breathtaking in its cynicism. Colonel Dax would successfully appeal the sentences, the 3 soldiers would be pardoned at the last moment, and the film would end with the men embracing their families while stirring music played on the soundtrack. Kubrick's reaction to this suggestion has been described by various sources as ranging from cold refusal to outright contempt. He understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone else involved, that a last-minute pardon would not merely soften the film's impact, but would actively destroy its meaning. The entire point of Paths of Glory was that the system does not correct itself. The innocent die. The guilty are promoted. Justice does not arrive. To paste a happy ending onto that thesis would be to turn an act of artistic courage into a comforting lie. Kirk Douglas, to his significant credit, backed Kubrick on this point despite his own instincts toward audience-friendly storytelling. Douglas recognized that the execution was the film's moral center of gravity, and that removing it would collapse the entire structure. Together, Kubrick and Douglas presented a united front against the studio, arguing that the film's commercial prospects, already slim given the subject matter, would be further damaged, not helped, by a false ending that audiences would see through immediately. United Artists eventually relented, but not without extracting concessions. The tavern scene with the German girl singing, the scene that provided the film's final emotional note, was partly a negotiated compromise, a way to give the studio its moment of human warmth without betraying the story's fundamental honesty. The soldiers still died, the generals still won. But the audience was given one small, fragile moment of grace before the credits rolled. The studio wanted a fairy tale. The filmmakers gave them a funeral with a single flower laid on top. It was the most either side could bear. Number 2. The film was used as a political weapon during the Cold War. Paths of Glory did not merely offend the French government. It became an active instrument in Cold War propaganda battles, deployed by both sides for purposes its creators never intended. The Soviet Union seized upon the film as evidence of Western imperialism's inherent cruelty. Soviet cultural officials pointed to Paths of Glory as proof that even America's own artists recognized the barbarism of capitalist military structures. The film was screened in Soviet-aligned countries with introductions that framed it not as an anti-war statement, but as an anti-Western one, conveniently ignoring the fact that the Soviet military had committed atrocities that dwarfed anything depicted in the film. Meanwhile, in NATO-aligned countries, the film's suppression became its own kind of propaganda. The fact that France had effectively banned the picture was used by civil liberties advocates as evidence that Western democracies were not as committed to free expression as they claimed. In West Germany, where the film was produced, screenings were politically charged events, with audiences reading the French military's institutional cruelty through the lens of their own recent history, under a regime that had perfected the art of executing its own citizens for insufficient loyalty. The United States military was not enthusiastic about the film either. While there was no formal ban, the Department of Defense declined to provide any support or cooperation for the production, a significant snub in an era when military cooperation was standard for war films. American military officials recognized that the film's critique of command authority, while directed at the French Army of 1917, could easily be read as a universal indictment of military hierarchy itself. The Pentagon wanted war films that celebrated sacrifice and duty. Paths of Glory suggested that sacrifice was meaningless when ordered by corrupt men, and that duty was a weapon the powerful used against the weak. Kubrick watched all of this with the detached fascination of a chess player observing a game he had inadvertently started. He had made a film about how institutions consume individuals. The institutions responded by trying to consume his film. The irony was perfect, and it was lost on almost everyone involved. Number 1. Kubrick married the German girl. Schachtum. And it changed everything. The single most improbable outcome of the entire Paths of Glory production had nothing to do with the film's critical reception, its political controversies, or its place in cinema history. It was this. Stanley Kubrick fell in love with the young German actress who sang the folk song in the final scene, and he married her. Her name was Christiane Harlan, and she would become Christiane Kubrick, his wife, for the remaining 42 years of his life. Christiane was a painter and actress working in German theater and film when she was cast in the tiny role of the captured German girl. Her scene required no dialogue in the conventional sense. She simply had to sing a German folk song, Der treue Hussar, the faithful hussar, to a room full of hostile, leering French soldiers, and gradually transform the room's energy from cruelty to sorrow. It is one of the most emotionally powerful scenes in all of Kubrick's filmography, and it was performed by a woman he had barely met. Kubrick was still married to his second wife, Ruth Sobotka, during the production of Paths of Glory, though the marriage was already disintegrating. When he met Christiane on set, the connection was immediate and profound. By the time the production wrapped, Kubrick's second marriage was effectively over, and his relationship with Christiane had begun. They married in 1958, just 1 year after the film's release. The significance of this personal story extends far beyond romantic biography. Christiane Kubrick became Stanley Kubrick's most trusted confidant, his emotional anchor, and his lifelong creative partner. She was present for the making of every subsequent Kubrick film, from Spartacus through Eyes Wide Shut. Colleagues and biographers consistently credit Christiane with providing the stability and warmth that allowed Kubrick, a man of legendary coldness and obsessive control, to function as a human being outside of his work. Without her, the career that produced 2001, A Space Odyssey, A Clockwork Orange, and The Shining might have looked very different or might not have happened at all. The darkest irony is that the scene that introduced them, the scene Kubrick did not want to film, the scene that was forced on him by Kirk Douglas in the studio, became the moment that defined the rest of his life. He fought against it. He resented it. And it gave him everything. The scene that saved the film's ending also saved the filmmaker. Bonus fact: the version we have may not be the version Kubrick intended. There is a persistent rumor among Kubrick scholars and film archivists that the version of Paths of Glory that exists today, the 88-minute cut that has been preserved, restored, and celebrated for decades, is not the version Kubrick originally assembled. According to several accounts from people who were present during post-production, Kubrick's first cut of the film ran significantly longer, possibly by as much as 15 to 20 minutes. This longer version reportedly included extended sequences in the trenches before the attack, additional scenes of the soldiers' daily lives that humanized them more fully before their condemnation, and a longer, more procedurally detailed version of the court-martial. If this longer cut existed, it has never been found. United Artists reportedly pressured Kubrick to trim the film for commercial pacing, and Kubrick, who later in his career would have absolute contractual control over Final Cut, did not yet have the power to resist. The excised material was not preserved in any known archive. In the era before home video, deleted footage from modestly budgeted productions was routinely discarded or allowed to deteriorate in studio vaults with no climate control. Kubrick himself never publicly acknowledged the existence of a longer cut, which is consistent with his lifelong policy of refusing to discuss abandoned versions of his films. He believed that the released version of any film was the only version that mattered, and that discussing alternatives was a waste of time. But several people who worked on the production have independently mentioned scenes they remember filming that do not appear in the finished picture. And the running time discrepancy between the first assembly and the final cut has been noted by more than one historian. The possibility that a fuller, rawer, even more devastating version of Paths of Glory once existed and was quietly destroyed by studio indifference is one of cinema's small, aching losses. We will likely never know what those missing minutes contained. The evidence was cut, and the negatives were never recovered. What remains is extraordinary. What was lost, we can only imagine. Paths of Glory should never have been made. It was too dark for the studios, too dangerous for governments, and too uncompromising for a commercial audience. Its director was too young, its star was too controlling, its extras were untrained police officers running through real explosions, and its subject matter enraged an entire nation so deeply that it was erased from their screens for nearly 2 decades. And yet, against every odd, through every battle, despite every force that tried to soften it or silence it, the film survived. It endures as one of the most powerful anti-war statements ever created, 88 minutes of cold fury that have lost none of their force in nearly 70 years. It was made in chaos, born in conflict, and preserved by stubbornness. It is proof that the best art does not come from comfort. It comes from the refusal to look away. If you want the dark truth behind more Hollywood classics, hit subscribe. We're just getting started.